Irshad's reactions to polygamy, child marriage, and female genital mutilation (FGM) in Saudi Arabia are depicted as deeply conflicted, resistant, and ultimately traumatized. Here's how she responds to each. Polygamy. Irshad is initially told by the wife of the Pakistani imam in Sydney that polygamy in Islam is only justified for strong reasons, such as infertility or illness. However, when her husband Mustafa marries a second wife, a 14-year-old girl, without any such justification, Irshad is shocked and protests. She is silenced by her husband, who cites the Quranic verse that allows men to marry up to 4 wives. This leads to a serious quarrel, physical abuse, and her second divorce. The experience is humiliating and deeply painful for her, and she feels powerless to stop it. The other thing that happened and turned her miserable married life into hell was when her Muslim husband married a second wife who was 9 years younger than her and 14 years younger than him. The new wife was 14 years old, and her husband was 28 when he took her as a second Muslim wife. As usual, when the Australian wife protested, she was silenced by a verse from the Holy Quran, which legalized polygamy. Child marriage. Irshad is horrified by the practice of child marriage, which she witnesses both in Saudi Arabia and later in Afghanistan. She sees underage girls being married off and even impregnated at ages as young as 12 or 13. When she protests, her husband and his relatives justify the practice by referencing the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha and Quranic verses. Irshad is appalled and powerless to intervene. Another practice that the Australian wife abhors, which is the marriage of underage girls. Often, child marriages between the ages of 10 and 11 were attended. Sometimes, in these child marriage ceremonies, Irshad met the underage married girls who were impregnated by their husbands when they were 12 or 13 years old. As usual, whenever the white wife expressed her anger to her Arab husband for this kind of abuse of female children, he confronted her with a verse from the Holy Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. Female genital mutilation (FGM). Irshad is strongly opposed to FGM, which she recognizes as abuse and a crime against girls. When she protests against the practice, her husband silences her by quoting hadiths that justify FGM as a preservation of honor for women. Despite her horror and repeated objections, her daughter is forcibly circumcised against her will, which devastates Irshad and is a turning point in her resolve to escape. The Australian wife knows that female genital mutilation is an abuse and a crime against a Muslim girl, but whenever she protests against it, her husband silences her through the hadith of the Prophet, in which he said, "Circumcision is a sunnah for men and a preservation of honor for women." Sunan Abu Dawud. The brutal circumcision performed on her daughter against her desire for the Australian wife created much resentment against her Arab husband and his Muslim relatives and caused untold turmoil in her mind. Summary: Irshad's reactions are marked by horror, protest, and deep emotional pain. She is repeatedly silenced by religious justifications and social pressure, but her opposition to these practices grows stronger, fueling her desire to escape and protect her children from similar fates. Her experiences with polygamy, child marriage, and FGM are central to her transformation from a compliant wife to a determined survivor and advocate. The fate of Mustafa's child bride and the genital mutilation of Irshad's daughter Aisha, as well as the psychological effects on the characters. Mustafa's child bride, fate, and psychological effects. Fate. Mustafa, after marrying Irshad, Susan, later takes a second wife who is a minor, just 14 years old at the time of marriage, while Mustafa is 28. This marriage is arranged without the girl's full consent, reflecting the practice of child marriage justified by certain interpretations of religious law. The child bride becomes pregnant at 15. During childbirth, she faces life-threatening complications. The midwife advises that she needs to be taken to a hospital for a cesarean section, but Mustafa refuses, fearing that a male doctor might see his wife's body. As a result, the young wife dies during childbirth due to lack of medical care. Psychological effects. The narrative shows that the child bride is isolated, powerless, and deprived of agency. She is forced into marriage and motherhood before she is physically or emotionally ready. The trauma of being married off as a minor, the fear and pain of childbirth, and the lack of support or autonomy contribute to a sense of helplessness and despair. The story also highlights the psychological impact on Irshad, who, despite her own suffering, feels pity for the child bride and recognizes her as another victim of a system that abuses and exploits girls. Genital mutilation of Irshad's daughter Aisha, fate and psychological effects. Fate. Irshad's daughter, Aisha, is subjected to female genital mutilation, FGM, at the age of 5, against her mother's wishes. The procedure is carried out by relatives and justified using religious texts and community pressure. The mutilation is described as brutal, leaving Aisha's genitals scarred and nearly closed, with only a small opening for urination. The narrative details the physical trauma, pain, and long-term sexual and reproductive consequences for Aisha. Psychological effects. Immediate trauma. Aisha experiences intense pain, fear, and confusion during and after the procedure. She is forcibly separated from her mother, which adds to her distress. Long-term psychological harm. The novel describes how FGM leads to lifelong trauma, including fear of medical procedures and intimacy, shame and confusion about her body, anxiety about future marriage and sexual relations, knowing that intercourse will be painful and traumatic, feelings of betrayal and abandonment, especially as the procedure is carried out by family members and justified by the community. Impact on Irshad. The mother suffers deep guilt, anger, and helplessness, knowing she could not protect her daughter. This event becomes a turning point in Irshad's resolve to resist and eventually escape the abusive environment. Summary table. Victim. Fate. Psychological effects. Mustafa's child bride. Married at 14, pregnant at 15, dies in childbirth due to lack of care. Powerlessness, fear, trauma, loss of agency, despair. Irshad feels pity and guilt for her suffering. Aisha, Irshad's daughter. Subjected to FGM at 5, left with severe physical and sexual trauma. Immediate pain and fear, long-term anxiety, shame, fear of intimacy, betrayal, and lasting psychological scars. Real-world parallels. Child marriage. Real-world research shows that child brides are at higher risk of depression, PTSD, and suicide. They often face isolation, loss of education, and lifelong health complications. FGM. The World Health Organization and psychological studies confirm that FGM causes immediate and long-term psychological harm, including PTSD, anxiety, depression, sexual dysfunction, and difficulties with trust and intimacy. In summary, both Mustafa's child bride and Aisha are depicted as victims of systemic abuse, child marriage, and FGM, leading to profound and lasting psychological trauma. The novel uses their stories to highlight the devastating impact of these practices on girls' and women's mental health, autonomy, and well-being. The 3x divorce, triple talaq, of Irshad by her husband Mustafa is a significant turning point in the novel, reflecting the intersection of personal conflict, religious law, and cultural pressures. Here's a detailed description of the circumstances that lead to this outcome, based on the text. First divorce. The first divorce occurs after a violent confrontation between Irshad and Mustafa over the issue of female genital mutilation, FGM. Irshad, horrified by the practice and its justification through religious texts, openly questions the authenticity of the hadiths that support FGM. This leads to a heated argument, during which Mustafa becomes enraged by what he perceives as her blasphemy and lack of submission. He physically assaults her and attempts to strangle her. The situation escalates until Mustafa's uncle intervenes and saves Irshad. In the aftermath, Mustafa announces her divorce in front of his uncle, but the uncle persuades him to take her back for the sake of their children. This is counted as the first divorce according to Islamic law. Second divorce. The second divorce is triggered by Mustafa's decision to marry a second, much younger wife, a 14-year-old girl, which Irshad strongly opposes. She protests the marriage, arguing that there is no valid reason for polygamy in their case, as she is healthy and able to bear children. Mustafa, however, insists that polygamy is his right under Islamic law and silences her objections by quoting the Quran. The conflict escalates into another serious quarrel and physical abuse, resulting in Mustafa pronouncing the second divorce. Again, his uncle intervenes to prevent a final separation, but the second divorce is officially counted. Third divorce. The third and final divorce occurs after Irshad attempts to escape Saudi Arabia with her 4 children, seeking help from the Australian embassy. When Mustafa discovers her plan, he reports her to the police, accusing her of kidnapping his children. Upon learning of her attempted escape, Mustafa pronounces the third divorce, which, according to Islamic law, is irrevocable. This ends their marriage permanently, and Irshad loses her legal status as his wife and her rights to custody of the children under local law. Summary table. Divorce. Triggering event. Key details. First, argument over FGM and religious texts. Physical assault. Uncle intervenes. Mustafa announces divorce, then takes her back. Second, Mustafa's polygamous marriage to a 14-year-old. Irshad protests. Serious quarrel and abuse. Uncle intervenes again. Third, Irshad's attempted escape with children. Mustafa reports her, pronounces final, irrevocable divorce. In summary, the 3 times divorce of Irshad by Mustafa is the result of escalating conflicts over religious practices, FGM, polygamy, and Irshad's desperate attempts to protect her children and escape abuse. Each divorce is marked by violence, religious justification, and the intervention of Mustafa's uncle, until the final break is made when Irshad tries to flee with her children. The divorces between Irshad and Mustafa have profound and traumatic effects on their children, both immediately and in the long term. Here's how the children are affected based on the novel's content. 1. Emotional instability and trauma. The repeated divorces create an environment of fear, instability, and emotional turmoil for the children. They witness intense arguments, violence, and the breakdown of their parents' relationship. This instability is compounded by the cultural and legal context, where the father's authority is absolute and the mother's position is precarious. The children see their mother being abused, beaten, and threatened with separation, which instills fear and anxiety in them. They are often used as leverage in conflicts between their parents, making them feel unsafe and powerless. 2. Loss of security and separation anxiety. After the third and final divorce, Irshad loses her legal status as Mustafa's wife and, under local law, her rights to custody of the children. The children are forcibly separated from their mother, which is deeply traumatic. As a result, the children of the Australian wife were taken from her and returned to their Arab father. When the Saudi husband, Mustafa, learned that his Australian wife, Irshad, was planning to kidnap his 4 children and run away from him, he divorced her for the 3rd time. According to Islamic law, this 3rd divorce is the final one, thus ending forever the abusive marital life between the foreign white wife Irshad and her Arab husband Mustafa. Of her attempted escape, Mustafa pronounces the 3rd divorce, which, according to Islamic law, is irrevocable. This ends their marriage permanently, and Irshad loses her legal status as his wife and her rights to custody of the children under local law. This forced separation causes the children to experience abandonment, confusion, and grief as they are suddenly cut off from their primary caregiver. 3. Exposure to abuse and indoctrination. With Irshad removed from their lives, the children are left in the custody of their father and his extended family, where they are at risk of being indoctrinated into extremist ideologies, especially the boys, who are expected to become martyrs or jihadis. The girls are at risk of forced marriage and further abuse, as described by Irshad's fears for their future. 4. Long-term psychological impact. The trauma of witnessing parental conflict, experiencing violence, and being separated from their mother leaves lasting scars. Some children develop behavioral problems, depression, or withdrawal. The sense of loss and betrayal can affect their ability to trust and form healthy relationships in the future. 5. Loss of maternal protection and advocacy. Irshad's presence is a source of love, protection, and advocacy for her children. Her removal means they lose their main defender against abuse and injustice. She knows she can do anything in life except to separate herself from her daughter, Aisha, and her son, Abu Bakr. Her stubborn Arab husband put his foot on the ground and said plainly that he and his 2 children would not leave their Muslim country and return to the land of the infidels. Meanwhile, the Australian wife cries day and night and begs her Saudi husband to keep his promise and return with her and their 2 children to Sydney, Australia, but her pleas and tears are ignored. Summary table. Effect on children. Description: emotional instability, fear, anxiety, and trauma from witnessing violence and divorce. Separation anxiety, forced removal from their mother, leading to grief and abandonment. Exposure to abuse/indoctrination. Risk of being raised as extremists or forced into child marriage. Long-term psychological impact. Behavioral problems, depression, difficulty trusting others. Loss of maternal protection. No advocate or defender against abuse and injustice. In summary, Irshad's children suffered deeply as a result of the divorces, experiencing emotional trauma, loss of security, and increased vulnerability to abuse and indoctrination. The novel portrays their suffering as a central reason for Irshad's desperate attempts to keep her family together and protect her children at all costs. Mustafa beats his wife Irshad for several reasons, all rooted in a combination of religious justification, patriarchal control, and his own psychological issues. Here are the main reasons, with direct references from the novel. 1. Questioning religious teachings and authority. Irshad is beaten when she questions or doubts religious practices and hadiths, especially those related to the treatment of women. For example, when she expresses doubt about the authenticity of hadiths that justify female genital mutilation, FGM, Mustafa becomes enraged. The fight occurred one evening after the foreign family had returned from a celebration of female genital mutilation of 5-year-old twin sisters. The screams and agony of these 2 little girls as their circumciser subjected them to such cruel and painful torture haunted the Australian wife's mind as a horrific nightmare. When she got home, she talked to her Saudi husband about it and expressed her doubts about the authenticity of those hadiths that justified such a vicious practice of the ancient Arab barbarians. When Mustafa confronted her, as usual, with 2 hadiths in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, and no Muslim scholar can dare to doubt the authenticity of a hadith mentioned in the 2 collections of hadiths, the Australian wife commented with the words of doubt that turned her Saudi husband into a voracious animal. 2. Disobedience or challenging his authority. Mustafa believes that, as a husband, he has religious and cultural authority over Irshad. When she disobeys him or challenges his decisions, such as objecting to polygamy, child marriage, or his control over her movements, he responds with violence. Since that day, whenever she disobeyed him or did something he considered wrong, he was always hitting her. She did not and was not able to question him or challenge his authority whenever domestic violence occurred. The religious justification for the husband's right to beat his disobedient or rebellious wife is mentioned in the Quran as clearly as the sun. 3. Religious justification for wife beating. Mustafa uses specific Quranic verses and hadiths to justify beating Irshad, especially when he suspects disobedience or rebellion. The religious justification for the husband's right to beat his disobedient or rebellious wife is mentioned in the Quran as clearly as the sun. Men are the maintainers of women because God has made some of them superior to others and because they spend of their wealth. To the unseen, as God has preserved. And those from whom you fear disobedience, admonish them and leave them in the beds and beat them. Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 34. 4. Cultural and social pressure. Mustafa is influenced by the patriarchal and misogynistic culture around him, which normalizes violence against women as a means of enforcing obedience and maintaining family honor. He is also encouraged by relatives and religious leaders to assert his authority through violence if necessary. 5. Psychological instability and jealousy. The novel also describes Mustafa as suffering from psychological issues, including jealousy, inferiority complex, and paranoia. These contribute to his violent outbursts, especially when he feels his authority is threatened or when he suspects Irshad of disloyalty or Western thinking. In summary, Mustafa beats Irshad whenever she questions religious teachings, disobeys him, challenges his authority, or simply as a means of control, always justifying his actions through religious texts and cultural norms. This violence is a recurring theme in the novel and is depicted as both a personal failing and a reflection of broader systemic abuse. The muhalil plays a specific and crucial role in the context of Islamic marital law. Duty of the muhalil. The muhalil is a man who marries a woman who has been divorced 3 times by her husband. According to the interpretation of Islamic law presented in the novel, after a husband divorces his wife 3 times, he cannot remarry her unless she marries another man, the muhalil, and that marriage is consummated. Only after the muhalil divorces her, or the marriage ends, can she remarry her first husband. After Irshad is divorced 3 times by her husband Mustafa, she is pressured to marry a muhalil so that she can become halal, permissible, for Mustafa again. The muhalil's duty is to marry Irshad, consummate the marriage, and then divorce her, thus fulfilling the religious requirement for her to remarry her first husband. Direct reference from the novel. If his nephew wants to get his ex-wife back, he must convince her to marry a muhalil man, which means that he is another Muslim man who can legitimize the pussy of a woman who has been divorced 3 times. Then Mustafa brought in a man who agreed to be the parser of the pussy of the ex-wife. According to the secret deal, the Somali man can sleep in the apartment one day, and the next day he must divorce the Australian girl, receive the rest of his money, leave, and never show his ugly face again to Mustafa or Irshad. This arrangement is depicted as deeply humiliating and traumatic for Irshad, and it is used in the novel to critique certain interpretations and practices of religious law. Mustafa's motivations for involving a muhalil are rooted in the specific interpretation of Islamic marital law depicted in the story. After divorcing Irshad 3 times, Mustafa cannot remarry her unless she marries another man, the muhalil, and that marriage is consummated and then ended. Only then can she become halal, permissible, for him again. Mustafa's motivations include religious obligation. Mustafa believes that, according to his understanding of Islamic law, he cannot take Irshad back as his wife after 3 divorces unless she marries and consummates a marriage with another man, the muhalil, who then divorces her. This is presented as a religious requirement he feels compelled to follow. Desire for reconciliation. Despite their tumultuous relationship and repeated divorces, Mustafa wants to reconcile with Irshad and have her as his wife again. The only way he sees this as possible is by arranging for a muhalil to fulfill the religious condition. Social and familial pressure. There is also pressure from Mustafa's uncle and the broader community to adhere strictly to religious law and customs, reinforcing the need for the muhalil arrangement before reconciliation can occur. In summary, Mustafa's motivation is a combination of religious obligation, personal desire to restore the marriage, and social pressure to comply with the rules as interpreted by his family and community. The novel uses this episode to critique and highlight the emotional and ethical complexities of such practices. Irshad's brutal rape by the muhalil. After the marriage on paper, the Somali man refuses to divorce his wife Irshad. When the Somali muhalil is pressured by Mustafa and the uncle, he agrees to divorce Irshad on one condition: she must sleep with him at least once. He insisted on tasting her honey, and she made his own, by inserting his cock into her pussy and fucking her, and his semen flew into her womb for once. The ex-husband and his uncle agreed to his immoral and humiliating condition for the Australian ex-wife because they knew it was required by Islamic law. However, the white wife Irshad adamantly refused to allow such a man whom she did not recognize as her husband to have sex with her even for a second. When the Australian girl refused to fulfill God and his prophet's condition, Mustafa and his uncle told her to pack her clothes and leave the apartment immediately. Irshad knew and understood that if she left, she could not dream of seeing her 4 children again, because in Islam there is no such thing as a visitation right for a divorced mother to her children who live with their father. So, because of her circumstances and her intense love for her 4 children, Irshad reluctantly agreed to fulfill the Sharia condition. Never has an Australian woman felt more humiliated and abused throughout her life than when the ugly Somali man brutally raped her in her bedroom with full knowledge of her Saudi ex-husband. Meanwhile, Mustafa sits outside his bedroom as if he were the bodyguard of his ex-wife's rapist or the pimp who brought a man to fuck his wife in his bed. The body of the so-called thrice-divorced wife's pussy parser emits a stench like the decomposing corpse of a dead animal. While raping her, his mouth produces a foul smell of snuff and bad breath. Looks like he has not brushed his yellow teeth or taken a shower in his life. He jumped over her body like an animal jumping over the body of a resisting female animal or a dog fucking its bitch in the street and in broad daylight. Irshad felt like a prostitute being raped by a homeless hustler who had come from the streets. Once he attacked her body, she began to fight back and push him away. He is such a strong man as the terrorist that she could not expel him from her body. She regretted that she had agreed to be locked in a room by a big padlock from the outside with such a beast man. She did everything she could to stop him from raping her. She scratched his face with her fingernails. She hit his body with her fists repeatedly. She bit his cheeks and shoulders with her sharp teeth. During her rape, she was screaming as loudly as possible and calling the name of her ex-Saudi husband Mustafa repeatedly, but no one came to save her from her pussy legalizer. Before his big erect cock emptied the semen into her pussy and then into her uterus, the Australian girl lost consciousness and became like a lifeless corpse. Nevertheless, the muhalal continued having sex with the dead woman because Islam permits a farewell nikah or sexual intercourse for a husband with his deceased wife before shrouding her corpse and burying her in a grave. When she managed to regain consciousness and open her eyes again, the Australian girl found herself in the hospital. Her Saudi ex-husband is standing like a devil in front of her with a terribly angry face. He looks at her accusingly, as if she had deceived him, cheated on him, slept with another man, and allowed him to fuck her with his cock in her pussy, and she did that in his apartment, in his room, and on his bed, which he bought with his own money. Instead of putting the blame on his prophet who authorized the husband to bring a man to fuck his wife in his bed to legalize her pussy for him, the Arab husband Mustafa put the blame on his Muslim wife Irshad, whom he divorced thrice. After the muhalal event, Irshad is left feeling deeply humiliated, traumatized, and emotionally devastated. The novel describes her experience as one of the most degrading and painful moments of her life. She is forced to marry and consummate a marriage with a stranger, the muhalal, so that she can be religiously eligible to remarry her first husband, Mustafa, after 3 divorces. Irshad's feelings after the muhalal event can be summarized as profound humiliation. Irshad feels that she has never been more humiliated or abused in her entire life. The act is depicted as a violation of her dignity and autonomy, leaving her feeling like a mere object passed between men for the sake of religious technicality. Emotional and psychological trauma. The experience leaves Irshad emotionally shattered. She is forced to comply with the arrangement against her will, and the trauma of the event lingers, affecting her mental health and sense of self-worth. Resentment and betrayal. Irshad feels betrayed by Mustafa and his family for subjecting her to such an ordeal. The forced nature of the muhalal arrangement, orchestrated by those she once trusted, deepens her resentment and sense of isolation. Loss of trust and intimacy. The event irreparably damages her relationship with Mustafa. Any remaining trust or intimacy is destroyed, and Irshad's feelings for Mustafa are further eroded by the ordeal. Direct reference from the novel. Never has an Australian woman felt more humiliated and abused throughout her life than when the ugly Somali man brutally raped her in her bedroom with full knowledge of her Saudi ex-husband. In summary, the Muhalal event leaves Ershad feeling violated, humiliated, and emotionally scarred, with lasting negative effects on her well-being and her relationship with Mustafa. After the Muhalal event, Ershad's coping mechanisms are shaped by the profound trauma, humiliation, and betrayal she experiences. The novel describes her as deeply scarred by being forced to marry and consummate a marriage with a stranger, the Muhalal, so she could remarry her first husband, Mustafa. Here's how she copes in the aftermath. 1. Suppression and endurance. Ershad initially copes by suppressing her pain and enduring the situation for the sake of her children. She feels she has no choice but to comply with the demands placed upon her, as her primary motivation is to keep her family together and protect her children from further harm. This endurance, however, comes at the cost of her own emotional well-being. 2. Emotional withdrawal. The trauma of the Muhalal event leads Ershad to emotionally withdraw from Mustafa. The trust and intimacy in their relationship are shattered, and she becomes distant, resentful, and unable to reconnect with him on a meaningful level. Her feelings for Mustafa are further eroded, and she struggles to forgive him for subjecting her to such an ordeal. 3. Internalization of pain. Ershad internalizes much of her pain, feeling isolated and powerless. She does not have a support system to help her process the trauma, and the cultural and familial pressures prevent her from openly expressing her suffering. This internalization manifests as ongoing emotional distress and a sense of hopelessness. 4. Focus on survival and children. Despite her suffering, Ershad's primary coping mechanism is to focus on the survival and well-being of her children. She continues to make sacrifices and endures further hardships to ensure their safety, even if it means suppressing her own needs and desires. 5. Long-term impact. The novel suggests that the trauma of the Muhalal event has lasting effects on Ershad's mental health and her ability to trust others. It becomes a defining moment in her journey, shaping her later decisions and fueling her eventual resolve to escape her circumstances and advocate for herself and her children. In summary, Ershad copes with the aftermath of the Muhalal event through endurance, emotional withdrawal, internalization of pain, and a relentless focus on her children's well-being. The experience leaves her deeply wounded, but it also contributes to her eventual transformation into a survivor and advocating for women's rights later in the novel. Mustafa refuses to allow Ershad to take their children to Australia for several reasons, all rooted in his religious, cultural, and ideological beliefs. Religious and cultural identity. Mustafa is deeply committed to raising his children as Muslims within an Islamic society. He fears that if Ershad takes the children to Australia, a secular, non-Muslim country, they will be exposed to Western values, lose their Islamic identity, and be raised as infidels rather than devout Muslims. He explicitly states that he does not want his children to grow up in a secular country like Australia, where, in his view, there is moral corruption, such as cohabitation without marriage, acceptance of homosexuality, and widespread alcohol and drug use. Legal and patriarchal authority. According to the Sharia law as depicted in the novel, custody of the children after divorce is awarded to the father. Mustafa uses this legal authority to prevent Ershad from taking the children out of the country, and the court supports his position. Distrust and accusations. Mustafa accuses Ershad of wanting to take the children away for selfish and lustful motives, suggesting she would seek a new relationship with a non-Muslim man if she returned to Australia. He frames her desire to leave as abandonment and betrayal of both him and their faith. Fear of losing control. Mustafa is portrayed as controlling and suspicious. Allowing Ershad to take the children would mean relinquishing his authority and influence over their upbringing, which he is unwilling to do. Direct evidence from the novel. As a Muslim father, Mustafa told the judge he did not want his Arab children to grow up in a secular country like Australia. He said in those infidel countries that a man and a woman live together in one bedroom without marriage and commit adultery freely and without fear of deterrence from parents or the police. And a homosexual man is allowed to marry another man and practice sodomy openly, and a woman can marry another woman, and both indulge in the practice of lesbianism. Alcohol is sold like groceries in stores. Porn videos are distributed among students in schools just like their textbooks, and drugs are sold to them on public streets. Then Mullah Abu Hamid accused her of neglect and told her that she had deserted her 7 children, threw them in his arms, and fled to her country, Australia, to find a white dick of an uncircumcised Christian infidel man to have sex with her uncircumcised hairy pussy. He claimed that she was a racist white woman, so she refused to marry him because he was an Afghani Muslim man who has a circumcised cock like the circumcised dick of the Prophet Muhammad, may God bless him and grant him peace, about whom his beloved child wife, Aisha, said that he could control his phallus. When the mullah accused her of racism, abandonment, desertion of her 7 children, and escaping to her motherland for selfish and lustful motives, the Australian woman was forced to reveal the troubles she faced in the cursed village of Sharif al-Banat with its notorious womanizer chief and her imprisonment in the infernal Kandahar women's prison. Summary: Mustafa's refusal is driven by his desire to ensure his children are raised as Muslims in an Islamic society, his legal rights under Sharia law, his distrust of Irshad's motives, and his need to maintain control over his family. The novel presents this as a central conflict in Irshad's struggle to protect and reunite with her children. How Irshad orchestrates her escape. After enduring years of abuse and realizing the dangers her children face if they remain in Saudi Arabia, Irshad becomes determined to escape with them to her native Australia. She is motivated by her fear that her sons will be indoctrinated into extremism and her daughters forced into early marriage, as well as her conviction that only in Australia can her children have a safe and hopeful future. To orchestrate her escape, Irshad plans in secrecy. She carefully considers the risks, knowing that Saudi law prohibits women from traveling without a male guardian's permission and that children cannot be issued passports without their father's consent. Seeks outside help. She befriends a Sudanese woman named Sulwa, who lives in a neighboring building. Through coded signals and cautious communication, Irshad manages to explain her predicament and ask for help. Creates a diversion. To attract attention and create an opportunity, Irshad sets some newspapers on fire in her apartment, prompting Sulwa to call the police and firefighters. When authorities arrive, Irshad claims she is locked in and that her husband has the keys, buying herself a few hours before her husband returns. Attempts to contact the embassy. With Sulwa's help, Irshad uses a phone to call the Australian embassy in Riyadh, explaining her situation and pleading for assistance in obtaining passports for her children and escaping the country. Consequences when she is caught by the police. Despite her careful planning, Irshad's escape attempt is ultimately unsuccessful. Police investigation. After her husband discovers her absence, he reports her and the children missing, claiming she has kidnapped them. The police launch a search and trace the phone call made from Sulwa's apartment. Arrest. Irshad, Sulwa, and Sulwa's husband are arrested. Irshad's children are taken from her and returned to their father. Final divorce. Upon learning of her escape attempt, Mustafa divorces Irshad for the 3rd and final time, making reconciliation impossible under Islamic law. Legal and social consequences. Irshad is interrogated and beaten by police, and her helpers are accused of conspiring with her. She loses all custody rights, as Saudi law grants custody to the father, especially after a final divorce. Irshad is left alone, separated from her children, and powerless to change their fate. In summary, Irshad's escape is a desperate, carefully orchestrated attempt involving secret communication, outside help, and a diversion. However, the strict legal and social controls in Saudi Arabia, combined with her husband's swift action, result in her capture, loss of her children, and further personal suffering. Here's a summary of the legal consequences as depicted in the novel. Legal consequences Irshad faces in Saudi Arabia. Arrest and detention. Irshad is immediately arrested by the Saudi police after her husband reports her escape attempt as a kidnapping of their children. She is taken into police custody for interrogation. Loss of child custody. Saudi law grants custody of children to the Muslim father in cases of marital dispute or divorce. As a result, Irshad's children are forcibly taken from her and returned to their father. She is denied any legal right to retain or even visit her children. Criminal charges. She is accused of kidnapping her own children, which is treated as a serious criminal offense. The authorities view her attempt to leave the country with her children as an abduction, especially since she is a foreign woman and the children are considered Saudi citizens. Interrogation and physical abuse. While in police custody, Irshad is subjected to harsh interrogation and is physically beaten by female police officers until she confesses her attempt to escape with her children. Divorce and marital status. Her husband immediately divorces her for the third time, which under Islamic law is final and irrevocable. This means she cannot return to him unless she marries and is divorced by another man, the halala requirement. No legal recourse. Irshad is denied access to legal representation or the ability to contest her case in court. The Sharia court system does not allow her to appoint a lawyer, and her testimony as a woman is given less weight than that of her husband. Social and religious stigma. She is branded as a criminal, an unfit mother, and an apostate by her husband's family and the broader community. This leads to further isolation and vulnerability. Threat of further violence. The narrative also describes the risk of honor-based violence or even death if she is perceived as having brought shame to her husband or his family by attempting to flee with the children. In summary, Irshad's attempt to escape with her children results in her arrest, loss of custody, physical abuse, criminal charges, forced divorce, and complete legal and social disenfranchisement. The novel highlights the lack of protection for women in such situations and the overwhelming power granted to the husband and his family under Saudi law and custom. The social impact on Irshad after her arrest for attempting to escape Saudi Arabia with her children is profound and multifaceted. Here's a detailed explanation based on the text. Social impact on Irshad after her arrest. 1. Stigmatization and social isolation. Irshad becomes a social outcast within her husband's family and the broader Saudi community. Her attempt to flee is seen not just as a legal crime, but as a grave social and moral transgression. She is branded as a criminal, an unfit mother, and even an apostate, which leads to her being shunned and isolated. 2. Loss of reputation and honor. In the conservative context depicted in the novel, a woman's honor is closely tied to her obedience and loyalty to her husband and his family. By attempting to escape, Irshad is perceived as having brought shame and dishonor not only upon herself, but also upon her husband's family. This loss of honor has severe consequences for her standing in society. 3. Vulnerability to abuse and violence. The social stigma attached to her actions makes Irshad more vulnerable to abuse. The narrative describes how, after her arrest, she is subjected to physical violence by police and is left without protection from further harm. The community's unwillingness to intervene or support her increases her risk of continued abuse. 4. Loss of social support networks. Irshad's ties to her own family and any potential support network are severed. Her conversion to Islam, marriage, and subsequent actions have already alienated her from her Australian family, and now her actions in Saudi Arabia cut her off from any support she might have had within her husband's community. 5. Permanent damage to motherhood and identity. The loss of her children and the inability to defend herself or reclaim her role as a mother is not just a legal blow but a social one. In the society depicted, a woman's identity is deeply connected to her role as a mother and wife. Being stripped of her children and branded as a criminal mother destroys her social identity and standing. 6. Enduring psychological trauma. The social consequences are compounded by psychological trauma. Irshad is left feeling hopeless, isolated, and desperate, with her sense of self-worth and belonging shattered by the community's rejection and the loss of her children. 7. No path to redemption. The novel emphasizes that, in this context, there is no clear path for Irshad to redeem herself socially. Her reputation is irreparably damaged, and she is left with little hope of regaining her place in society or her family. In summary, Irshad's arrest leads to her being ostracized, dishonored, and left utterly alone in a hostile environment. The social impact is as devastating as the legal consequences, leaving her without support, protection, or hope for social rehabilitation. Sharia court sessions, Irshad's custody battle. After her final divorce from Mustafa, Irshad, formerly Susan Peterson, seeks custody of her children in Saudi Arabia. The sessions in the Sharia court are depicted as formal, rigid, and heavily biased against her as a foreign woman and a mother. Courtroom atmosphere and procedure. The court is presided over by a single elderly male judge, known as Maulana, who is treated with great reverence and whose decisions are final and unappealable. There are no lawyers allowed. Only the two parties, Irshad and Mustafa, are permitted to speak before the judge. The judge is seen as infallible, and his rulings are considered to be divinely inspired and above any secular law or appeal. Irshad's arguments. Irshad tries to present evidence that her ex-husband is abusive and that she would be a better guardian for the children. She cites specific abuses, such as female genital mutilation performed on her daughter against her wishes, and the forced marriage of her husband to a minor as a second wife. She also mentions Mustafa's physical violence towards her and the children. Judge's response and ruling. The judge systematically dismisses all of Irshad's arguments, justifying each practice, FGM, polygamy, wife-beating, as being sanctioned by the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad. He lectures Irshad on the religious and cultural norms, emphasizing that the husband's authority and rights are protected by Sharia law. The judge states that, according to Islamic law, custody of the children after divorce belongs to the father, especially if the mother is a foreigner or is perceived as less religiously suitable. Mustafa's arguments. Mustafa claims that Irshad attempted to flee Saudi Arabia with the children, which he frames as kidnapping. He argues that he does not want his children raised in a Western, non-Muslim country, citing concerns about Western values and practices. Outcome. The court rules in favor of Mustafa, granting him full custody of the children. Irshad's testimony is given little weight, and her status as a foreign woman and a convert is used against her. The judge reinforces that the children must be raised as Muslims in Saudi Arabia, and Irshad is denied any meaningful visitation or custodial rights. Direct reference from the novel. The elderly judge already knows that Sharia law does not allow a mother to have custody of the children, but for the sake of formality, he asked the Australian woman to tell the court why she wanted to keep the children. She used the female genital mutilation of her young daughter, Aisha, as a reason, but this reason was rejected on the grounds that it is from the Sunnah imposed by the infallible Prophet of God that Muslim girls must be circumcised. Then she referred to the second marriage of her Arab husband to another Muslim wife. Judge Maulana gave her a lecture on the importance of completing the Sunnah of the Prophet by marrying more than one wife. Finally, the divorced white girl, Irshad, mentioned that her ex-husband, Mustafa, used to beat her a lot and even kicked and slapped his children from time to time, for or without reason. Maulana responded by saying that Mustafa, as a husband and father, is allowed under the Quran and encouraged by the Prophet of God to beat his disobedient wife and rebellious children. Summary. The Sharia court sessions are depicted as deeply patriarchal and dismissive of Irshad's pleas, with religious law and tradition used to justify denying her custody. The process leaves Irshad powerless and highlights the challenges faced by women, especially foreign women, in seeking justice and protection for their children in such a legal system. Sharia court sessions, Irshad's demand for the custody of her children. When Ershad, after her divorce from Mustafa, seeks custody of her children, she is required to appear before a Sharia court in Saudi Arabia. The novel describes the court as a place where no lawyers are allowed. The court does not permit legal representation. Only the two conflicting parties, Ershad and Mustafa, are allowed to present their cases directly to the judge, who is referred to as Maulana or the Venerable Imam. This judge is seen as infallible and his decisions are final, not subject to appeal, even by the king. Religious authority dominates. The judge is an elderly religious figure, not a secular legal professional. He is treated with reverence and his rulings are considered divine judgments. Ershad's arguments are dismissed. Ershad tries to argue that her ex-husband is abusive and that her daughter was subjected to female genital mutilation and forced marriage. The judge, however, rejects these arguments, stating that such practices are part of the Sunnah tradition of the Prophet and thus religiously justified. He also dismisses her complaints about polygamy and domestic violence, citing Quranic verses and hadiths that support the husband's authority and right to discipline his wife and children. Custody is awarded to the father. The judge rules in favor of Mustafa, stating that under Islamic law, custody of the children belongs to the father. The mother's testimony is given less weight, and her evidence is systematically refuted by religious doctrine. In summary, the Sharia court sessions are depicted as rigidly patriarchal and religiously conservative, with little room for the mother's perspective or for challenging traditional practices. Ershad's attempts to gain custody are thwarted by the court's adherence to religious texts and its prioritization of the father's rights. Here's a comparison of Ershad's trauma as depicted in For the Sake of My Children by Dr. A. Ahmed, with real-world cases and psychological research on women escaping abusive marriages and losing custody of their children in Saudi Arabia and similar contexts. Ershad's trauma in the novel. Severe psychological distress. Ershad experiences depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, and suicidal thoughts after her arrest, abuse, and forced separation from her children. Loss of identity and self-worth. She is stripped of her role as a mother, isolated, and stigmatized, leading to profound feelings of worthlessness and despair. Chronic fear and helplessness. Living under threat of further violence, legal punishment, and social ostracism, she develops chronic anxiety and a sense of powerlessness. Long-term psychological scars. Even after escaping, Ershad struggles with trust, intimacy, and a sense of safety, showing the enduring impact of trauma. Real-world parallels. 1. Psychological impact of domestic abuse and custody loss. Depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Studies of Saudi women who have experienced domestic violence show high rates of depression, anxiety, and poor quality of life. Abuse is a powerful predictor of these mental health issues. Loss of confidence and social isolation. Women who are victims of intimate partner violence, IPV, in Saudi Arabia report loss of confidence, psychological distress, and social withdrawal. Social support is often lacking, which exacerbates these effects. Stigma and powerlessness. Real-world cases echo Ershad's sense of powerlessness and social stigma. Women who attempt to escape abusive marriages or seek custody of their children are often ostracized, shamed, and left without support. 2. Separation from children. Profound trauma. Research shows that forced separation from children causes acute trauma for mothers, including depression, anxiety, and long-term psychological distress. The trauma is compounded by legal systems that often favor fathers in custody disputes. Neurobiological effects. Studies indicate that mother-child separation can cause neurobiological vulnerability, leading to lifelong emotional and psychological challenges for both mother and child. 3. Real-world escape cases. Dina Ali Lasloom, attempted to flee Saudi Arabia for asylum, was forcibly returned and feared for her life. Her case sparked global outrage and highlighted the risks women face when trying to escape abusive situations. Bethany Al-Haidari, an American woman who escaped Saudi Arabia with her daughter, facing ongoing trauma and fear of being forced to return. She describes the potential return as detrimental and traumatic for both herself and her child. Rahaf Muhammad fled Saudi Arabia, barricaded herself in a hotel room in Bangkok, and publicly described the psychological terror and abuse she faced under the guardianship system. 4. Mental health effects of legal and social isolation. High psychological distress. A significant proportion of Saudi women report moderate to severe psychological distress, especially when lacking social support. Family relationships, while sometimes supportive, are also a major source of stress. Barriers to seeking help, stigma, lack of resources, and restrictive laws prevent many women from accessing mental health care, compounding their trauma. Summary table: Irshad's trauma versus real-world cases. Aspect: Irshad novel. Real-world cases. Depression and anxiety. Severe, persistent, leads to suicidal thoughts. High prevalence among abused women in Saudi Arabia. PTSD and long-term trauma. Nightmares, flashbacks, chronic fear. Documented in women separated from children or escaping abuse. Loss of identity. Stripped of motherhood, social role, and self-worth. Common among women who lose custody or are ostracized. Social isolation. Complete isolation, no support network. Many women lack support, face stigma, and are shunned. Legal disempowerment. No legal recourse, testimony devalued, denied custody. Legal systems often favor men. Women face barriers to justice. Real escape attempts. Arrest, abuse, forced return, or successful asylum with ongoing trauma. Documented in cases like Dina Ali Lasloom, Bethany Al-Haidari, Rahaf Muhammad. Conclusion: Irshad's psychological trauma in the novel is highly consistent with real-world experiences of women in Saudi Arabia and similar contexts who attempt to escape abuse or are separated from their children. Both the novel and real cases highlight severe mental health consequences, depression, anxiety, PTSD, loss of identity and social standing, profound isolation and lack of support, enduring trauma, even after escape or legal resolution. These parallels underscore the urgent need for legal reform, social support, and mental health resources for women in such situations, both in fiction and reality. After her traumatic physical, sexual, mental, and legal abuses in Saudi Arabia, Irshad, former Susan, begins to suffer from severe depression, anxiety, and PTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It is a mental health condition that can develop after a person experiences or witnesses a traumatic event, such as violence, abuse, war, a serious accident, or any event that causes intense fear, helplessness, or horror.